So, picking back up on the second half of our section on status organizing processes and expectation states. Your activity 5 is in the process of being graded, and hopefully, I will get that done sooner rather than later. The next 2 weeks are going to be pretty hectic for me as a student. So, I'm going to try to grade a few every day and hopefully get them done quickly. But like I said, the next 2 weeks is going to be pretty hectic. So stand by on that. Quiz 5 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. and make sure to complete the assigned reading for this week and watch the supplementary videos. So, as a quick refresher, expectation states theory aims to explain how our preconceived notions about others based on their identities are the basis for status hierarchies in small groups. It says that these differences in evaluations and attitudes result in observable differences in interaction. So, why expectation states theory matters? Well, on the group level, we evaluate others' competence and credibility based on status characteristics. So, that being socially significant characteristics, rewards, and behavioral interchange patterns, which then go on to form the basis for status hierarchies. And these trends tend to perpetuate themselves over time, resulting in certain types of individuals having more influence and power over others. And status hierarchies based on perceptions of things like class, race, gender, and age may be fostered and perpetuated by what happens in small group interactions. Again, it's important to point out though that expectation states theory is a it's a uh, specifically designed tool to answer specific questions in specific contexts. And so applying expectation states theory to a more macro setting isn't necessarily appropriate, although it has been done in some limited capacity because expectation states theory is designed um, to be applied in small groups specifically. But there have been these considerations about how what happens in small groups could then go on to perpetuate more macro level inequalities. And while that's something that's important and good to consider, it's not necessarily something that has been shown in the research. That's kind of an area for development beyond expectation states theory, um, and maybe kind of create a an expectation states theory specifically for more macro level application or something that's bridging the two. But again, it's not something that's necessarily been shown. So when we talk about expectation states theory, it's to be applied specifically to small group settings. And so in everyday life, while expectation states theory does not address the origins of status beliefs, the focus is instead on how these status beliefs influence people's attitudes, perceptions, and behavior. Higher status members are more likely to be listened to, receive more positively, and exert more influence within the group. And there may be backlash against those of lower status in positions of authority because their power is perceived as illegitimate. And so this clearly has practical implications in any situation in which status distinctions can be particularly salient. In such situations where members of one group are perceived to have greater status and legitimacy than members of another group, expectation states theory can be useful in predicting how members of both the higher and lower status group will act and treat one another. In the workplace, this theory can predict backlash against um, female leaders because women are often ascribed a position of lower status than men. So when a woman in a leadership position exercises authority, expectation states theory predicts that there may be backlash against her on the grounds that her power is perceived to be illegitimate. And again, that's just one example from the research. They primarily focused on things like sex and gender, which they conflated those two a bit. But what they've seen is that in the workplace, if someone's power based on one of these status characteristics is perceived as illegitimate, that regardless of whether or not they're in a position of authority, that perceived illegitimacy can have effects on perceptions of that particular authority figure and also influence group dynamics. So, another quote that says, when the eyes say one thing and the tongue another, a practiced man relies on the language of the first. Um, so, these quotes about leadership that I keep including might initially be seen as inspiring or like good advice, and which maybe they are. I'm not saying one way or the other, but when you think about these from an expectation states perspective, it makes them take a bit of a darker tone. Instead of listening to what a person says about their competence and their ability and their experiences, we might um, be more likely to rely on these different status characteristics based on different social identities, role identities. We might look at things like rewards or behavioral interchange. And we're watching um, uh, these different status characteristics and what information they can tell us about this person and their ability to contribute to the group and the value of their contribution, whether or not that's necessarily true, whether or not that has anything to do with their actual competence and ability to contribute, as well as the value of their contribution. So, application and research. Expectation states theory has been subjected to rigorous empirical evaluation, which has generated considerable evidence in support of the theory. And so, here are some examples. We're going to talk about some examples that I found in the research that I thought were interesting, compelling, and relevant to some of the things that you have all discussed, either what you want to do as a career or just what you find interesting in general. So, one example that they found in unequal status groups is so when peers interact, they look more at each other while listening than while speaking. And so, in one study, they found when male ROTC officers and cadets interact, officers looked as much while listening and speaking. So, someone of a higher status is looking much more while listening and speaking, or looking as much while listening and speaking. Whereas when peers are interacting, they tend to look more while listening than while speaking. So we can see these status or these behavioral interchange patterns and how they differ among people of higher and lower and equal status. And then they found that cadets looked substantially more while listening than while speaking, um, which is so you have like right when there's two peers that's in an equal status group, they tend to look more while listening than while speaking. But when you're in an unequal status group, those who are of higher status tend to look as much while listening and while speaking, whereas those of lower status in the group, um, especially when interacting with those of higher status, they look substantially more while listening than while speaking. And so these specific research endeavors are focusing on what they call eye gaze. So that's those behavioral interchange patterns. And of course, we know kind of the nature of these relationships and which position is of higher status, which position is of lower status. But if you don't know, um, perhaps you can look at these different behavioral interchange patterns. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is how someone of a higher status will behave in every single situation, every single time. But it's just something that we've found in terms of these behavioral interchange patterns and what they can tell us about a person's status within a group. So, in again, these unequal status groups or these status unequal groups, So what they did is they replicated the previous study, specifically in female dyads, so two females in a group, and they were differentiated by age and educational attainment. So made unequal in terms of status by age and educational attainment. And one thing they found was that high status females looked while speaking nearly as much as while listening, and low status females looked much more while listening than while speaking. They also found that when the same high and low status females were placed in subsequent interactions with a new partner who was their equal in status, they reverted to the more usual proportions among peers. Um, so, this suggests to us that we do have some sort of understanding of status, and there are different ways of engaging and interacting with others, whether that's showing what we might call more like dominant or like assertive behavior, so making more eye contact, or more deference in the situation, so knowing not to make eye contact as much in some situations than in others, depending on our status within the group. And so I believe that in this study, they specifically told them that they were of higher or lower status. However, you might see something like age, and you can tell for the most part if someone is quite a bit older than you or quite a bit younger, and what that might mean in terms of status in that interaction and how that might influence those behavioral interchange patterns. And so, one of the vocal cues most commonly studied in relation to status is the speed with which a person responds to a group task. One study told female participants whether they were higher or lower than their partners in a task. And they found that subjects assigned to high status were more likely to respond before their partners on problem solving trials. So again, thinking of these different performance expectations of others, and how that influences people's expectations of themselves within that particular interaction, given their perceived status. So the perceived status of other group members, it's always relational. So maybe it's in relation to one other person or two other people, or, five other people. So these different performance expectations and how they influence, again, the way that we interact with each other, who's more likely to speak first, who's more likely to hold eye contact longer. And again, these aren't meant to be universal or absolutes. It's just something that is seen to be significant patterns in this type of research on expectation states. And so, again, these are all in status and equal groups or in equal status groups. So they're of differing statuses. And we see that there does seem to be this difference in terms of someone who's higher status tends to be the one who initiates and holds eye contact longer, and is also the one to speak before their partners in different task situations. And another study examined loudness and speech rates of men and women in same and mixed sex groups. So, although there were no effects on speech rates, women tended to speak louder in task oriented discussion with women than with men. And these results demonstrate that much nonverbal behavior between males and females in task situations reflects the status value of being male or female rather than distinct sex role based behavior. So, in status equal groups, some researchers suggest that eye contact behaviors reflect perceived status differences. One study measured the eye glance hierarchies of three man and three woman groups. Subjects' position in the initial eye glance hierarchy they found correlated positively and significantly with the participation rank they later achieved during group discussion. So, staying in equal status groups, one study argues that group members with the minority opinion can influence the majority if they actively present their point of view with consistency and confidence. So, in a follow up, researchers found that a Confederate holding a minority opinion was influential when he was seen actively choosing a head seat before interaction, but not when he was assigned the seat. And so, a couple of things to note here is that one, keep in mind that in experimental settings, a confederate means the person who's in on it. So, they're aware of what's going on. They're the person who's put into the situation, who's is instructed to act a particular way within that setting, but they're aware of what's going on. So they found that those who were holding a minority opinion in the group, they were especially influential or more effective at influencing the majority when they were seen actively choosing a head seat. So, like again, a seat at the head of the table before the interaction, but not when that seat was assigned. So, looking again at those behavioral interchange patterns. So, and people expressing different types of behavior and how that's viewed in terms of status and ability. So someone who is seen as, perhaps confident taking that particular seat, they're actively choosing it, might be seen as someone who should be given more influence and more esteem in the group than someone who maybe was just assigned to that seat. So this shows that nonverbal behavior and the nature of responses relative to other group members leads to attributions of confidence, independence, or competence, and increases the influence and status they attain in the group of peers. So again, this is very much focused on those behavior interchange patterns, but of course we are combining these with other types of status characteristics when those are salient in that particular group setting. But that is all for today. Your quiz 5 is due Friday, and make sure to read the supplementary reading that is posted on Canvas. But other than that, I hope you all have a great week, and we will meet again Wednesday. Thanks.